The wind howled through the gaps in Robert Miller's old barn as rain pounded against its metal roof. At 68, he had grown used to the sounds of his farm at night, but something was different this time. A noise that didn't belong caught his attention, a soft whimper that wasn't from any animal he knew. Robert set down his cup of evening tea and pulled on his rain jacket. His joints protested as he grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer. The clock on the wall showed just past midnight, and normally he would have been in bed by now. But 40 years of farming had taught him never to ignore strange sounds from the barn. The rain soaked his boots as he crossed the muddy yard. Lightning flashed overhead, briefly illuminating the old red barn that had stood on his property for 3 generations. Another whimper, barely audible over the storm, convinced him he wasn't imagining things. The barn door creaked as he pushed it open. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness, moving across the familiar shapes of his tractor, stored hay bales, and old farm equipment. Everything looked normal, but then he heard it again. A sound like a frightened child trying not to cry. "Hello," Robert called out softly, not wanting to scare whatever was hiding. "It's all right. You can come out." He kept his voice gentle, the same tone he'd used years ago when helping injured animals. The answering sound came from behind the stack of hay bales in the corner. Robert moved slowly, his flashlight beam lowered to avoid startling anyone. As he rounded the hay bales, he stopped dead in his tracks, his free hand gripping the rough wood of a support beam to steady himself. There, huddled in the corner, was a child, but unlike any child he had ever seen. Its skin had a silvery sheen that seemed to catch and reflect his flashlight's beam. Large, dark eyes blinked up at him, filled with a mixture of terror and exhaustion. The creature wore what looked like a torn metallic suit, its material unlike anything on Earth. Robert's mind raced with questions, but they all took a back seat to what was clearly obvious. This child, whatever it was, needed help. Its small frame showed signs of malnutrition, and it was shivering, though whether from fear or cold, he couldn't tell. He slowly knelt down, his old knees protesting against the hard barn floor. The child pressed further into the corner, making a sound that reminded him of wind chimes in a gentle breeze. Robert reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the granola bar he always kept there for emergencies. "Here," he said softly, unwrapping it with deliberate slowness. "You must be hungry." He held it out, then placed it on the ground between them, sliding it forward with one finger. The child's eyes darted between his face and the offered food. Robert noticed how its silver skin seemed to shift colors slightly, taking on a lighter shade. Slowly, carefully, a small hand reached out. The fingers were longer than a human child's would be, with an extra joint, but they trembled with the same uncertainty he'd seen in scared animals. The granola bar disappeared into its grasp, and Robert watched as the child sniffed it cautiously before taking a tiny bite. A moment later, the whole bar was gone, and those large eyes looked at him with a mix of hope and desperation that transcended species. Robert's mind went to the soup warming on his stove back in the house. He had planned to have it for supper, but this child needed it more. Still moving slowly, he stood up and took a step back, then gestured toward the barn door. "There's more food in the house," he said, making eating motions. "And it's warm and dry there." He pointed to the rain outside, then to his home where warm lights glowed in the windows. The child tilted its head, reminding Robert of the curious birds that sometimes visited his bird feeder. He took another step back, then waited. After what felt like an eternity, the small figure rose on unsteady legs. Robert noticed how it favored its right side, possibly injured. As another flash of lightning illuminated the barn, Robert saw something that made his heart ache. Behind the child lay a small device, cracked and dark, that looked like some kind of distress beacon. Whatever had brought this little one to his barn, he realized, had not been an accident. It had been searching for help. "Come on," he said softly, holding out his hand. "Let's get you somewhere safe." The walk from the barn to the house seemed longer than usual as Robert carefully matched his pace to the alien child's hesitant steps. Rain continued to pour, but he held his jacket over the small figure, letting himself get soaked instead. Each flash of lightning made the child flinch, and Robert found himself humming an old lullaby his mother used to sing, hoping the gentle sound would help. Inside the kitchen, warm light spilled over them both. For the first time, Robert could clearly see the child's features. The silvery skin had a pattern to it, like tiny scales that shifted colors with each movement. Despite the alien appearance, the fear and exhaustion in those large eyes were unmistakably familiar. The same look he'd seen in Lost Children at the county fair years ago. Robert pulled out a kitchen chair, wincing at the scraping sound that made the child jump. "Here," he said softly, patting the seat. "You can sit." He demonstrated by pulling out another chair and sitting down himself. After a moment's hesitation, the child copied him, perching on the edge of the seat like a nervous bird. The soup on the stove had stayed warm. Robert ladled some into a bowl, adding an extra spoon of the thick broth. He set it down carefully, along with a spoon and some crackers. The child stared at the spoon with confusion until Robert demonstrated its use with his own bowl. The first few spoonfuls were clumsy, but hunger quickly led to mastery. Robert noticed how the child's skin tone shifted to a warmer silver as it ate, wondering if this was a sign of improved health or emotion. When the bowl was empty, those large eyes fixed on the pot hopefully. "Of course you can have more," Robert said, already standing to refill the bowl. "Eat as much as you want." He added more crackers to the plate, then watched as they disappeared just as quickly as the first serving. After 3 bowls of soup, the child's movements became slower, heavy with what Robert hoped was contentment rather than illness. He needed to know if the food was safe for the child's system, but had no way to ask. Instead, he watched carefully for any signs of distress. The child's attention wandered around the kitchen, stopping at the window where stars peeked through breaks in the storm clouds. A small hand pointed upward, and a sound like crystal wind chimes filled the room. The child repeated the gesture more urgently, then made a downward swooping motion before hunching forward in what looked like sadness. "You came from up there, didn't you?" Robert asked gently, pointing to the stars. The child nodded, a human gesture that surprised him. And something bad happened. The downward swooping motion was repeated, followed by a sound that needed no translation. Grief. Robert fought back tears of his own. Whatever had happened up there had left this child alone, and while he didn't understand the how or why, he understood loss. He'd felt it when his wife Mary passed 5 years ago, leaving him alone on the farm they'd shared for 4 decades. The child shivered, and Robert suddenly remembered the wet clothes. He went to his bedroom and returned with one of his softer flannel shirts. "It's not much, but it's warm and dry." He held it out, mimicking putting it on over his own clothes. The child studied the shirt before carefully removing the torn metallic suit. Underneath was something like a thin bodysuit that seemed to shift and move with the child's skin. The flannel shirt went on over this, its sleeves rolled up many times to fit. The sight of the tiny figure swimming in his enormous shirt made Robert smile, and to his delight, the child's mouth curved upward in what appeared to be a smile as well. A loud crack of thunder made them both jump, and without thinking, Robert reached out to comfort the startled child. To his surprise, a small hand grabbed his, holding on tight. The skin felt smooth and warm, almost like touching silk warmed by sunlight. "You're safe here," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I don't know where you came from or what happened, but you're safe now." Though the child couldn't understand his words, the gentle squeeze of his hand got a responding squeeze in return. Outside, the storm began to fade, and through the kitchen window, more stars became visible. The child's free hand pointed to them again, but this time without the earlier desperation. Instead, the gesture seemed more like showing something to a friend. Robert squeezed the small hand gently, understanding that sometimes words weren't needed at all. 2 weeks had passed since the stormy night, and Robert's kitchen had become a classroom of sorts. Every morning, he and the alien child would sit at the table, pointing at objects and sharing their words for them. The child's language sounded like music, full of rising and falling tones that Robert could barely copy, but he tried anyway, often making the child's silvery skin ripple with what he now recognized as amusement. "Cup," Robert would say, holding up his coffee mug. The child would respond with a melodic sound like tinkling bells, then attempt the English word, making it sound more like "cup." They would go back and forth until both were satisfied, then move on to the next object. Some days they learned 5 new words, other days only 1, but Robert never pushed too hard. He had started calling the child Star after noticing how often those large eyes turned toward the night sky. The name seemed to please her. Robert had begun thinking of Star as female after she pointed to a picture of his late wife Mary, and then to herself, making the same musical note both times. Star was a quick learner, but some concepts proved harder to share than others. She often tried to explain something about the food, making frustrated sounds when Robert couldn't understand. He noticed she would eat everything he offered, but some foods seemed to satisfy her less than others. After each meal, she would touch her wrist, where a faint pattern glowed briefly before fading. One morning, Star surprised him by drawing in the dust on the kitchen window. Her long fingers moved with purpose, creating simple but clear pictures. A ship among the stars, then the same ship falling, breaking. She drew 4 figures, then crossed out 3 of them, leaving one small figure alone. When she looked at Robert, her skin had turned a dull gray color he had come to associate with sadness. "Your family," Robert said softly, pointing to the crossed-out figures. "They didn't make it." Star nodded, another human gesture she had picked up quickly. She added more to the drawing. A small figure walking, searching, finding the barn. Then she drew Robert's figure, adding a simple curved line that was clearly a smile. Robert had to turn away for a moment, wiping his eyes. When he turned back, Star had cleared the window except for one word she had copied from his calendar. "Help." She pointed to it, then to herself, then to her wrist where the pattern had appeared again, glowing more faintly than before. "You need help," Robert said slowly. "Something's wrong." He pointed to the wrist pattern, and Star nodded vigorously. She went to the fruit bowl and picked up an apple, then made a gesture like something passing through her without stopping. Next, she took a vitamin pill from Robert's daily supplement box and repeated the same gesture. Understanding dawned. "The food isn't enough," Robert said. "You're missing something you need." Star's skin brightened slightly, encouraged by his comprehension. She made a series of gestures, pointing to the stars, touching the pattern on her wrist, then slowly lowering her hand toward the ground while her skin dulled again. That evening, they sat on the porch swing, something that had become their nightly routine. Star had brought her torn spacesuit, carefully showing Robert the patches where some kind of display had once been. Though the technology was far beyond anything he had seen, the purpose seemed clear. It had monitored her health. Robert reached over and took her small hand, noting how the silver skin felt slightly cooler than it had the first night. Star leaned against his arm, making a soft sound like distant wind chimes. Above them, the stars emerged one by one, and she pointed to a particular cluster, making the same musical note she used for home. "We'll figure this out," Robert promised, though he knew she couldn't fully understand his words. "Whatever you need, we'll find it." Star squeezed his hand in response, and together they watched the stars wheel overhead, each lost in thoughts of family. One lost, one newly found. Robert watched with growing concern as Star pushed away her breakfast plate, barely touched. Her silvery skin had taken on a dull, almost ashen tone over the past few days, and her movements had become slower, more careful. The pattern on her wrist now glowed so faintly it was barely visible, even in the dark. He had tried everything he could think of: vitamins, protein shakes, even special supplements from the health food store in town. Nothing seemed to help. Star tried to hide her weakness, still helping him with small chores around the house, but yesterday she had dropped a cup because her hands were shaking too much to hold it. After clearing away the dishes, Robert went to his study and picked up the phone. His fingers hovered over the numbers before finally dialing one he hadn't called in months. It rang 3 times before a gruff voice answered. "Tom, it's Robert Miller. I need your help, but you have to promise to keep what I'm about to tell you a secret." He listened to his old friend's confused response, then added, "Can you come out to the farm today? And bring your medical bag, the one you used when you were still practicing." Dr. Thomas had been the town's veterinarian for 40 years before retiring. More importantly, he had been Robert's friend since childhood and had kept every secret they had ever shared. If anyone would understand and help, it would be him. An hour later, gravel crunched in the driveway as Tom's old pickup truck pulled up. Robert met him on the porch, trying to figure out how to explain. But before he could speak, Star appeared in the doorway behind him, curious about their visitor. Tom's medical bag hit the porch with a thud. "Good Lord, Robert," he whispered, his eyes wide but his voice steady. "When you said you needed help with something unusual." "She's sick, Tom," Robert said quickly, before his friend could say anything else. "She needs help, and I don't know what to do." He explained everything. Finding Star in the barn, her deteriorating health, their attempts at communication. Tom listened without interrupting, his eyes never leaving the small figure who now stood partially hidden behind Robert. Finally, Tom picked up his bag. "Well," he said slowly, "I've never had a patient quite like this, but sick is sick. Let's take a look." He followed Robert into the kitchen, where Star usually felt most comfortable. To Robert's relief, she seemed to sense Tom's gentle nature, just as animals always had when he was practicing. Tom's examination was careful and thorough. He checked Star's pulse, listened to her breathing, and noted how her skin temperature was lower than it should be. Star cooperated, though she held Robert's hand the entire time. When Tom tested her reflexes, she made a sound like breaking glass, the first time Robert had heard that particular tone from her. "Her heartbeat is too fast," Tom said finally, packing away his stethoscope. "And she's showing signs of severe malnutrition, but not like any I've seen before. It's as if her body can't process what she's eating, like she's missing something essential." He ran a hand through his gray hair, thinking, "You said she keeps pointing to her wrist, and there's some kind of pattern there." Robert nodded, and Star held out her wrist, where the pattern flickered weakly. Tom studied it, then pulled out his phone and took a picture, zooming in to examine the details. His eyes suddenly widened. "Robert, look at this pattern. Doesn't it remind you of something? The way the lines connect." He held out the phone, showing a close-up of the geometric design. Robert squinted at the screen, then felt his breath catch. "The rocks," he whispered. "The ones in my grandfather's collection. The ones he swore came from a meteor shower." He looked at Tom, hope rising in his chest. Could it be that simple? Could she need something that's not from Earth? Tom was already reaching for his bag again. Only one way to find out. "Where's that collection now?" "In the attic," Robert said, already heading for the stairs. "Star, stay with Tom. I'll be right back." He took the stairs 2 at a time, his old joints protesting, but his heart racing with possibility. Behind him, he heard Star make the musical note that meant help, followed by Tom's gentle voice telling her everything would be all right. For the first time in days, Robert felt real hope. If he was right about the meteor rocks, they might have just found a way to save Star's life. The attic was thick with dust, as Robert pulled down the old wooden chest his grandfather had always kept locked. His hand shook slightly as he opened it, revealing dozens of strange-looking rocks nestled in faded velvet. Each one had unusual patterns that seemed to catch the light in impossible ways. Robert gathered them all in his shirt and hurried back downstairs. In the kitchen, Tom had set up a portable microscope he sometimes still used for analyzing samples. Star sat nearby, her skin now so pale that it was almost transparent, but her eyes fixed intently on the rocks as Robert laid them on the table. The moment he set them down, Star made a high, clear sound they had never heard before. Her hand reached out, trembling, toward a particularly dark stone shot through with blue crystals. The pattern on her wrist suddenly glowed brighter than it had in days. "Look at that reaction," Tom said softly, picking up the stone Star had reached for. "The mineral structure in these is like nothing I've ever seen." He placed one under his microscope, adjusting the focus. "Robert, these aren't just unusual rocks. Whatever they are, they're not from Earth." Star was now holding one of the stones, pressing it against her wrist where the pattern glowed. Her skin began to take on a healthier silver sheen almost immediately. She made the musical note that meant help again, then pointed to her mouth. "She wants to eat it," Robert asked, worried. "Tom, is that safe?" Tom was already examining another stone. These seemed to be made of some kind of crystalline material. If her species evolved somewhere these elements were common. He looked at Star, who was now trying to bite the stone. "Wait," he said, reaching for his bag. "Let me try something first." From his bag, Tom produced a small grinder he used for preparing medicine samples. He carefully broke off a small piece of the blue-streaked stone and ground it into a fine powder. Star watched intently, her skin rippling with colors they had never seen before. Robert found a clean glass and filled it with water. Tom added the powder, stirring carefully. The water took on a faint bluish tinge. They both looked at Star, who reached for the glass with eager hands. "Slowly," Robert cautioned, helping her hold the glass. Star took a careful sip, then made a sound like singing crystals. Color flooded back into her skin, the dull gray replaced by bright silver. The pattern on her wrist glowed strongly, pulsing with a steady rhythm. Over the next hour, Tom ground small amounts of different stones, testing each one by adding a tiny bit to water and watching Star's reaction. Some produced stronger responses than others, and they carefully noted which ones seemed to help the most. "We'll need to be scientific about this," Tom said, making notes in his old medical journal. "Track which minerals help most, figure out the right dosage." He looked up at Robert. "Good thing your grandfather collected so many of these. We should have enough to last quite a while." Star had regained enough strength to walk around the kitchen. She went to the window and pointed at the evening sky, making a series of musical notes that sounded like a question. Robert came to stand beside her, understanding what she was asking. "Yes," he said softly. "These came from up there, like you did." He picked up one of the remaining stones, holding it so it caught the last rays of sunlight. "My grandfather used to tell me they fell during a big meteor shower when he was young. He always said they were special." He smiled at Star. Guess he was right. Tom finished packing away his equipment. "I'll come back tomorrow to check on her. We'll need to monitor this carefully. Make sure we're not giving her too much or too little." He put a hand on Robert's shoulder. "You did good, old friend. Not many would have taken in a strange child from the stars." Robert watched as Star pressed her small hand against the window, tracing the first stars appearing in the darkening sky. Her other hand still clutched one of the meteorite stones, and her skin shimmered with healthy color. "She needed help," he said simply. "Nothing strange about that." Star turned and gave him what he now knew was her kind's version of a smile. A ripple of light across her skin like sunshine on water. Some things, Robert had learned, were truly universal. The black SUVs first appeared on a Tuesday morning, crawling slowly down the county road that passed by Robert's farm. From his porch, he watched them through his old binoculars, noting the government plates and the men in dark suits who occasionally stepped out to talk to neighbors. Inside the house, Star was helping with the dishes, her health much improved thanks to Tom's carefully measured mineral solutions. She had learned enough English now to form simple sentences, though her voice still carried musical undertones that made the words sound like singing. "People looking?" she asked, coming to stand beside Robert at the window. Her silver skin dimmed slightly. She had learned to control its glow to appear less noticeable when they had rare visitors. "Just some city folks," Robert said calmly, though his heart was racing. Nothing to worry about. But later that day, when Tom came by for Star's weekly checkup, Robert shared his concerns. "They're asking about lights in the sky from 3 weeks ago," Tom said, checking Star's vital signs. "Mrs. Johnson down at the diner said they were particularly interested in any unusual sounds or sightings." He packed away his stethoscope, frowning. "We need to be more careful." They had already moved Star's damaged spacecraft parts from the barn to the root cellar, buried under old farm equipment. The meteorite stones stayed hidden in different spots around the house, never more than a few pieces together. But their biggest challenge was keeping Star's presence secret from increasingly curious neighbors. The next day, Robert's nearest neighbor, Betty Wilson, dropped by unexpectedly with a pie. "Thought you might like some company," she said, trying to peek around Robert as he blocked the doorway. "Been seeing your lights on late at night lately. Everything okay?" "Just some trouble sleeping," Robert answered, accepting the pie while keeping the door mostly closed. "Getting old, you know how it is." Behind him, he could hear Star quickly moving upstairs, their practiced routine when anyone visited. Betty lingered on the porch. "Heard some funny noises from your place last night. Almost sounded like singing, but not like any singing I've ever heard." She looked at Robert carefully. "And Tom's been coming by an awful lot for a retired vet. Been having some trouble with the barn cats," Robert lied, hating the taste of dishonesty, but knowing it was necessary. "Tom's helping me sort it out." He managed a smile. "Thanks for the pie, Betty. I should get back to my chores." That evening, as Robert and Star ate dinner, headlights swept across the kitchen windows. Robert peeked out to see one of the black SUVs parked at the end of his driveway. Star quickly turned off the lights, and they sat in darkness, watching as men with flashlights walked the perimeter of his property. "Remember what we practiced?" Robert whispered. Star nodded and moved silently toward the root cellar entrance, hidden under the kitchen rug. It was their emergency plan. If anyone ever came to the house, she would hide in the cellar until Robert gave their special signal. 3 taps on the pipes. The knock on the front door came just as Star pulled the cellar door close. Robert waited a moment, then turned the lights back on and walked slowly to answer it, trying to calm his racing heart. 2 men in suits stood on his porch, badges held out. "Evening, Mr. Miller. We're with the government investigating some unusual phenomena in the area. Mind if we ask you a few questions?" "At this hour?" Robert asked, channeling the grumpiness of age that he usually tried to hide. "Can't this wait until morning?" "We won't take much of your time, sir," the taller agent said smoothly. "We just need to look around the property. There have been reports of unusual lights and sounds." Robert leaned on his cane, a prop he had started using recently to appear more frail. "Well, I'm an old man who goes to bed early. Haven't seen anything strange except those fancy cars of yours disturbing my sleep." He paused, then added, "Though if you're interested in lights, you should talk to Jim Peterson over on County Road 8. He's always going on about UFOs and such." The agents exchanged glances, making notes. After a few more questions, they left, their headlights disappearing down the dark road. Robert waited until he was sure they were gone before tapping the signal on the pipes. Star emerged from the cellar, her skin glowing with relief in the darkness. "Close one," Robert said softly, hugging her. Star nodded, making the quiet chiming sound that meant she was worried. "Don't worry," he assured her. "We'll be more careful. Nobody's going to take you away." The first snow of winter dusted Robert's farm in white, marking 6 months since Star had first appeared in his barn. She stood at the kitchen window, her silver skin reflecting the morning sunlight as she watched snowflakes dance in the air. Her health had improved dramatically thanks to Tom's mineral solutions, and she had grown stronger each day. "Cold white?" she asked in her musical voice, pointing outside. Her English had improved greatly, though she still added singing tones to each word. "Snow," Robert corrected gently. "Would you like to go outside and touch it?" Star nodded eagerly, already heading for the coat Robert had bought her, child-sized, purchased from the store 2 towns over where nobody knew him. They walked together in the snowy yard, Star's delighted laughter sounding like wind chimes in a breeze. She picked up handfuls of snow, watching in fascination as it melted against her warm, silvery skin. Robert showed her how to make a snowball, and soon they were engaged in a gentle snowball fight, their joy echoing across the quiet fields. Later, as they sat by the fireplace drinking hot chocolate, Star's new favorite earth drink, she grew quiet, her skin taking on the deeper silver tone that meant she was thinking seriously about something. Finally, she spoke in her own language, a series of musical notes that Robert had learned to understand over their months together. "My people will come," she sang softly. "When the stars align right, they will find me." She switched back to English, wanting to make sure Robert understood completely. "Not soon, but they will come." Robert felt his heart tighten, but he had always known this day would come. "Of course they will," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "That's good. You should be with your people." Star reached over and took his hand, a gesture she had learned from him. "You are my people too," she sang. "Earth Father." It was what she had started calling him recently, and each time she said it, Robert felt his eyes grow misty. "When they come," she continued, her musical voice determined, "I tell them about you, about Tom, about Earth kindness." Her skin rippled with colors that showed her emotion. "I come back to visit. Many times. Promise." Robert squeezed her small hand gently. "I'd like that," he said softly. "This will always be your home too, Star, whenever you want to come back." They spent the rest of the evening as they often did now, with Star teaching Robert about the stars. She had drawn maps showing her home system, explaining through a mixture of English, her musical language, and gestures about her world and its 3 moons. Robert, in turn, shared stories about Earth, about his life, about the grandfather who had unknowingly collected the very meteorites that would one day save his alien granddaughter. As the fire burned low, Star pulled out the small device she had been working on, parts salvaged from her crashed ship, combined with simple Earth electronics Robert had bought her. She had explained that it would help her people find her when the time was right. The pattern on her wrist, now healthy and glowing, would connect with it somehow. "Not yet ready," she said, setting the device aside. "Many more snow times first." She looked up at Robert, her large eyes reflecting the firelight. "Time to learn more Earth things. Time to be family." Robert smiled, remembering how frightened they had both been that first night in the barn. Him of the unknown, her of being alone on a strange world. Now, watching Star curl up contentedly in what had become her favorite armchair, he felt nothing but gratitude for whatever twist of fate had brought her to his farm. "Family," he agreed, adding another log to the fire. Outside, snow continued to fall, covering their footprints from the afternoon's play. Somewhere up there, Star's people were looking for her, but for now, she was safe and loved on Earth. And when they did come, they would find not a lost, starving child, but a strong young being with 2 worlds to call home. Star made the musical sound that meant contentment, her skin glowing softly in the firelight. Together, they watched the flames dance and listened to the winter wind, each thinking of the strange and wonderful ways that families could be found among the stars.